Morning. Thank you for joining us here at the Hive office. Today we're going to have a discussion about, is spring the best time to start your beehive? So we're going to have a look in these hives here. It's not spring here in the southern hemisphere, but it is spring in the northern hemisphere. And it's a question that often comes up. If you've got answers to that question, then put it in the comments below, and also let us know if you've got any questions. Put them in the comments below as well. We'll answer them while we're live. Now, what I'm going to do is open the side windows of this flow hive and just have a look what's going on, because really it's about what's going on in the environment is the answer to, is spring the best time to get going? So if you have a look in this window, we've got a little bit of glistening nectar coming in and some patchy capped honey cells. If you have a look at those, you can see some capped, they've uncapped, they've eaten them away, but now they've got a little nectar flow coming in, and if you look closely you can see that little glint in the bottom of the cells, that nectar that they're drying out and turning into honey. It's a beautiful thing to be able to open the windows and watch what they're doing. And when you do that, you get a lot of information on what's going on. So basically, what you're trying to do for your colony is make sure they get off to a good start. So you doesn't necessarily have to be spring, but spring is often the time when you get a lot of flowers flowering. They have a lot of energy in spring, and a whole lot of species flower at that time. So often spring is the best time, especially in those colder places where there's a long cold winter. The flowers are waiting, and they all go boom and start dripping to the ground with nectar. And that is an absolutely great time to get started. However, if you're in the more temperate climates here, we're in a subtropical region, you can actually start almost any time of the year that there is nectar and flowers. So anytime you've got an abundance of flowers and nectars and pollen for the bees to build their brood nest. They take about one whole frame of honey and one whole frame of pollen to raise a frame full of babies. In the bottom box here, you've got just the conventional wax frames that the bees are raising their young in, and they'll often keep a honey frame on the edge and some pollen here, and then the babies in the center of the hive. So if you're in Australia, it doesn't mean you can't start now, but it depends where you are. If you're down south in the colder parts of Australia, you might not want to start this time of year because there's a long winter ahead. Having said that, in Australia we don't get huge long winters, so you could probably still start in the summertime. We're just into autumn now, and we're into spring in the northern hemisphere. So we're going to keep looking at different observations in the apiary. If you've got questions, put it in the comments below. Also let us know if you've started a hive that's in spring or not in spring. Let us know how it went. Ultimately, we want to learn from all of the knowledge that's been so far, all of the beekeepers that have tried all sorts of things, and then use that to make sure we have the best start in beekeeping. If we have a look at this hive, I can see in the side window some beautiful yellow wax and even some glinting nectar down the cells. So it shows there is a bit of a honey flow coming on. There is, it's probably the melaleuca, which is the paperbark. It gets called the rain tree here by our indigenous people because it flowers after the rains, and it can flower almost any time of year, especially in the winter time, which is fantastic for us because it's this boost for the bees right through the winter, and we get quite a good honey crop off the melaleuca, the paperbark, in the winter time. Now this hive happens to have a window on the bottom box also, so let's have a look at what's going on here. Now you've got lots of bees, you've even got brood all the way out to the window. So that's telling us that this is quite a strong colony. There's plenty of bees. There'll be plenty about to hatch. You could even take a split this time of year if you wanted to, because you've got so much brood in there. Wow, look at this. You've got beautiful waggle dances going on. See this one here? See that bee just ahead of my fingers, waggling its bottom and moving around. Let's see what pattern it's moving in. It's if it was moving in a round dance, then that would mean the nectar is nice and close. If it's in a figure of 8, it would mean it's further away, and it would have the axis of the figure of 8 pointing in the direction according to the sun to give you the actual direction of where the nectar or pollen source is, which is extraordinary to have that language and to be able to even start to understand it. There's all sorts of waggle dances going on. Any questions? Put them in the comments below and we'll get to answering those. So it's a wonderful thing. It's also a nice thing to watch the entrance of the hive, because you can see the bees coming in often loaded with pollen. And if you have a look at their back legs, you'll see these orange balls or these white or yellow, even purpley coloured balls of pollen, depending on what they've collected from the flowers. So it's a wonderful thing to be able to just observe your colony and see what's going on. Ultimately, if you're starting a colony, you just want them to have a good start. You want them to have enough forage, enough nectar, enough pollen to get a really good head start and establish some stores so that they can ride through times when the flowers aren't so present.
Cedar, we have a question from Mark. Why don't you sell ideals?
Okay. In Australia, it's not so popular to sell ideals, so that's probably the main reason. The beekeepers often just stick to the one size to keep things simple, to keep things easy. Now, it's not to say that we can't do that in the future. We have had a few requests, so if you'd like to buy Ideal, which is like a shorter sized bee box, if you look at this box here, instead of having a full size deep, which is about this big, you've got a box which is this big and also frames to suit it. So if that's something you would like, then put it in the comments below and we will. That's actually a march fly, not a bee, landing on my nose. They're flies that like to suck your blood. They're a bit annoying, but it's actually March. They don't usually come in March, but here it is, March, and we have March flies. But yeah, if you'd like ideals, put it in the comments below. It'd be nice to get an idea if there's lots of people wanting that.
Mike would like to know, does the hive need to face in a particular direction?
Okay, that's a good question. Now, if you read lots of bee books, they'll often say that you should face it so that it gets some nice sunlight in the morning. So in the southern hemisphere here, that would be towards the northeast. So in the morning, the sun would beam in, wake them up early, and I'd get out foraging. But that kind of thinking has come from the commercial apiarists that are really wanting maximum production. If you're keeping bees in your backyard, then there's some things that would be a priority ahead of maximum production, like making sure that the flight path of the bees isn't going to be bothering people as they walk past, making sure that it's not pointing at your neighbour's washing line, because when they fly out and do a poo, those little yellow dots could get on their washing, and things like that. We've got a video called Situating Your Hive, and it goes into details on different things you should consider. But ultimately, you can put a hive anywhere, full sun, full shade, pointed any direction. It doesn't matter. It's more about consideration of safety of others walking past, and annoyances of neighbours also.
Mari has a weak hive and has fed them once. She's wondering how often should she feed them?
Okay, if you've got a weak hive and you're feeding it. Now, around here, I don't tend to do any feeding of hives because there's always something around. However, if you're in a colder place or in a place where there's been lots of fires and there's not much forage around, you could consider feeding them to build up some stores to keep your colony going. In the end, you don't want them to starve. So if they've got no honey stores at all, you can't see any honey stores, then feeding them some sugar water could be a good idea. Now, whether you continue feeding them depends on whether they're getting on their feet and they've got enough to keep going. When you've got your honey collection box on, or your flow super or any other conventional box where you're collecting honeycomb, then you want to not feed them because you don't want to store sugar in your honey stores. Otherwise your honey will have sugar in it, which isn't the best. I would much rather it be the beautiful honey that we're after.
Nicole is in Colorado, USA, and says, my flow hive is set up and my bees arrive at the end of April. I bought a box instead of a nuke. I know I'll need to feed sugar syrup at first. Should I feed pollen powder patties as well?
Okay, the best information about that will come from your local beekeepers. So there are plenty of beekeepers that in the colder regions that will feed prior to a spring flow. It's usually in order to get maximum advantage of the honey flow from the flowers. So commercial beekeepers will feed up, get a big colony going, so when the spring bloom happens, they're already a few weeks ahead and your bees are ready to go get that nectar. For you, it might not matter so much. You might just be able to let them naturally build in the cycle that they do. When the nectar comes, the queen will start laying, that she'll lay more and more, and the colony will grow as the spring blooms.
Roberto's asking, how do I avoid getting stung from bees? I know they're not aggressive, but do I need to be concerned if I'm around a box like you are?
So the answer is actually the genetics. So we have safety information on the bottom of all of our pages. It's important to be aware of the risks involved. You know, there are severe allergic reactions that some people have to bees. Luckily, I don't have that. I can get stung multiple times. I'll get a bit of swelling, but there's no allergic reactions. In terms of tips and tricks to minimise stings, wearing a bee suit's a great idea. Wear your gloves if you're new to beekeeping, and the genetics of your hive. If you're ordering your bees, order some nice calm bees from a bee breeder, and that will make a huge difference. This hive here I can stand right in front of and they won't sting me, but I do have a hive at home. I've got about 40 hives at home, and I know one of them, if I get within a few metres, they're starting to give me warning buzzes, and that's just because they're particularly aggressive, and the queen has mated with aggressive genetics from aggressive drones around in the forest, and she will carry on laying eggs that have that aggressive trait. Now, if you've got a hive that is aggressive, it's starting to bother people, chase people around the yard, then it's a good idea to switch the queen to one that's already mated with some calm genetics, and you can buy queens like that from all queen breeders. And you might need help to do that if you're new to beekeeping, to get in there, pull your hive apart, find the queen and replace her. But yeah, genetics is a big one, makes a huge difference. But wear your bee suit, wear your gloves until you get really comfortable with your bees.
So I'm not sure if Lauren is referring to this hive here that has the window in the brood box as well as the super, but yeah. She says, why do you have two supers? Would you harvest from both or just the top?
Okay, so this is at the bottom box here. You've got a brood box. If you just want to spin the camera around, you've got a brood box, and this happens to have a window on the side, and that's where all the babies are being raised. You can see the brood inside the window and the bees doing their thing down there. Then the bottom box is the top box is the honey collection box. So that's where we have our flow frame invention that my father and I spent a decade inventing, and that's the bit that allows you to tap the honey off into your jar without having to open your hive.
Is there a time when you would run 2 supers?
Sure. There's in this area I tend to just like a single super, but there are plenty of beekeepers that will run double supers, and that's totally fine. You'll get more honey storage. The flow hive does have the advantage of being able to keep up with the bees and tap off the honey as they fill the frames. The conventional beekeeping, you tend to store more honey on the hive so you can process it in batches, because the processing is such a big labour intensive thing to do. You may as well really dedicate a weekend or a week to it to really process all of your honey at once. And you tend to, in the conventional setup, build the honey up on the hives, take all those boxes off to the processing shed, and then go through that decapping and spinning and filtering all at once. Flow hive is a bit of a different mentality. You can keep tapping it off as they go, and therefore not have to have so many supers on your hive. Now, having said that, some people like to add another super or another brood box if they just want to allow more room for your bees. Some parts of the world the bees build up very quickly, especially in cold climates where the season is compressed into a much smaller season. All of the species of plants and trees that are going to flower will flower at once, and the bees are booming. Their queen's laying a few thousand eggs a day. They're building up really fast, and in those places, like in Canada, you might need to have some more boxes just to house the numbers of bees in your hive. Or you could choose to take splits regularly through that season and increase the numbers of hives you have. Different strategies there, different beekeepers will do it different ways.
Michael's asking, what are the disadvantages of a horizontal hive? And is it better to have foundation in your brood frames, or do you go foundationless?
Okay, starting with the foundationless question, I prefer to go foundationless. So for those that don't know what I'm talking about, in the bottom box we just have a wooden frame, which is just a wooden frame like this, and just a little stick in the top, a comb guide, and the bees just hang their natural wax from it. That's what I like to promote, because the bees get to size the cells just how they like it for themselves. And also, I'm a bit lazy, and I'm sick of that putting the foundation wax in the frames and going through that wax and wiring with the jumper leads and so on. It can be fun for a while, but I much prefer the bees to just take care of it. And the disadvantage of that is sometimes they'll go wonky. You need to push them back online until you get some nice straight frames, and then they'll follow suit. So it's a little bit more management in the hive, but I find that more fun than sitting there waxing and wiring frames all day. I've done enough of that in my life, and I'm really happy not to do it anymore. Some people put plastic foundation sheets in the bottom box. In my experience, they take a long time to use them, especially if the flow's not so good. I prefer just to let them build it completely natural themselves, which confuses people, because in the bottom box we've got completely natural as you can go. In the top box we have our invention frames that is really, really different, so we're a bit of a mix of both worlds there. Now the next question was,
what are the disadvantages of a horizontal hive?
Okay, so by horizontal it means creating a hive that looks like a, well, probably the wrong use of a word, but a long coffin. And in that you put your frames, and you can put flow frames in a hive like that too. You can have ones that have sloping edges, like a top bar hive. If you look up top bar hive, you'll get what we're talking about here. Or you can have ones with straight edges and use conventional Langstroth frames in it. And you can also adapt that to put flow frames in, and people do. It can be quite a good way to go. The advantage is you can access your brood easily. The disadvantage is in my mind there's a couple of disadvantages that I can think of, but if you can think of more you can put them in the comments below. One is the the warmth of the brood nest in a hive like this travels up to the super and keeps your honey warmer. And that means if you've got some nectar sources like rapeseed, for instance, that candies very quickly, except for when it's warm, the bees will actually keep that warm. Conventional beekeepers often find that it's in between taking that box of rapeseed off their hive to the processing shed is when the candying happens. So with the flow hive, if you're quick enough, you can tap that off without a problem as well. So the warmth is one thing. Another one is matching what's currently happening. So this style of beekeeping, the Langstroth beekeeping, is by far the most popular in the world. So in some ways, you've got a lot of people with experience in that, you've got a lot of people that can help you with that, and you've got a lot of equipment that can match with that. So that's another advantage. But by all means, muck around and create yourself horizontal hives as well. It's good fun. Doesn't matter what type of beekeeping you do. It's fantastic to be experimenting and looking after the bees, and in doing so, you get that beautiful reward of learning about the bees in our environment and also the honey.
Naomi would like to know, what's the reason behind people running Ideals?
So Ideals is a shorter honey box, so the main reason is it's lighter. So keeping bees in the conventional way, you're stacking lots of boxes, and some places like Michael Bush in Nebraska, right? He's there on a step ladder. Boxes so tall he's on a step ladder to get them off, and he's cracking the boxes off, and he's taking the boxes down the step ladder, and there's honey dripping all over his head, and there's almost impossible if you use deep sized boxes. They're just too heavy to do that kind of thing with. So for that reason, people tend to use shallower honey boxes for the honey and deeper ones for the brood. The deeper ones for the brood to match what bees like to do, which is to have a bit of a deeper frame for their brood nest. Now, here in Australia, people tend to just use deeps. New Zealand's pretty similar with that. In North America, there is a lot of Ideals, and also in Europe there's a dozen different sizes and shapes of boxes that are being used as well. Even deeper, bigger ones that are even heavier. So there's all sorts of things all over the world, but if I was putting Ideals on, it would probably be for the reason of collecting a bit of honeycomb. You get these cute little honeycombs in frames that you can take out, take to a party and put on the table. It's a beautiful thing. Because we're not stacking lots of boxes really high, we've just stuck with the flow frame in the deep size. Reason being is by the time we put a movement mechanism in and a spot for the honey to drain out, if we went to a shorter size box, there'd be quite a narrow section of comb for the bees to use, which for probably a similar expense of being able to create that, we would get a lot less honey storage. So that's the reason why we do the deeps for the flow frames. And also, to get your honey off, you can use a tap instead of having to lift that hive off. However, you still need to lift that box off to inspect your brood. So that's probably where the request for the Ideals is coming from.
We have a customer in Hawaii saying, will the flow hive work if the honey I'm targeting is thick?
Okay, so thick, yes. The thick honey just takes longer to come out. Now, but if you mean thixotropic honey, which is the honey like the jellybush here or the manuka in New Zealand, that's got a whole different property. It sets like jelly in the frames, and no matter what extraction method you use, it's very hard to get out of the frames. Having said that, unless you're really going to target them, you're unlikely to get 100% jellybush or thixotropic honey. And if you've got a 50-50 mix, what you'll find is it'll just come out in globules, and you'll see these globs coming out of the flow frames into your jar. So it'll still work when you have a mix. If you've got 100%, you can get into a situation where it sets in the frames, and you'll have to use another method by using spikes typically, and centrifuges to get honey out of frames when they've got that real jelly-like property. We don't seem to find that around here, and it was a big concern in the beginning, but we actually don't get much feedback that is a problem in people's flow hives. So if you have found it a problem, let us know. Be really interested to hear whether thixotropic honeys are causing issues for people.
Shane's in Sydney and says, I did my first split on my flow hive in October. It was a successful split and both hives are healthy. I was wondering, when the hive is looking to swarm later this year, would it be better to create another split or add an additional brood box to the existing healthy hive?
Okay, great question. So what I tend to do is take splits, because if you don't want another colony, somebody else really will want another colony, and you can either sell that to them and help them get started, which is a wonderful thing to do, or you can keep it yourself and expand your apiary. I always find having multiple hives is great. You find one colony that's slow, one that's fast, and one that's in between, and that way you're more likely to get some beautiful different flavours of the seasons in jars on your shelf. So you can add another box if you want to also, and you can potentially do both, and it depends on your season. If you've got a real booming season, I've got hives at home that have an extra honey super on them. Also got hives at home that have an extra brood box on them. It all works. The one thing you will find that if the numbers drop for some reason, like your queen is getting weak, or perhaps they've swarmed and the colony's got to build up again, if you have multiple boxes, let's say you've got 3 or 4, then you might need to downsize them so that there's enough bees to really look after all of the comb surfaces. Otherwise, if you've got a lot of hive beetles in your area, they could take over the frames, and not enough bees to really police the frames and keep those hive beetles under control. So there's a few considerations there. Also, when it comes to the winter time, you might need to pack your colony down a bit and have a smaller colony. Easier for them to keep warm if you have a multiple stacked hive. But having a third box is quite normal. A lot of people do that.
Kevin has said that it doesn't work in cold climates like Wisconsin.
Okay, so I'd be interested to hear your direct feedback if you've tried that, and if there's been an issue with that, because from the very beginning, even before we started, we had people telling us it doesn't work in cold climates, and that rumour has been circulating around particularly Europe, but we have plenty of beekeepers in Europe, plenty of beekeepers in North America, plenty of flow hive beekeepers in Canada, even as far as Norway, and it definitely does work in cold climates. So if you're having an experience and it doesn't work, then get in touch and let's see if we can work out why, and see if we can get you going in that cold climate. Generally, when you're harvesting, it's a warm time of year. Even in the cold climates, it's a warm time of year, and you've got so that the honey will flow out quite nicely. We've experimented with harvesting honey even in 0 degrees Celsius temperatures, and it still comes out. It just comes out very slowly, so it might take a number of hours to fill your big jar or drain out that frame, instead of in an extreme situation in the heat of summer, 10 minutes and you've harvested that frame. So temperature does affect the speed, but it still works cold or hot.
Di would like to know, how do I mow my lawn around my beehive so I don't disturb and affect my bees?
Okay, that's a great question. We're starting to get a bit of rain, so we've got time for one more question, and then we'll get going. So mowing your lawn, it can be a bit of a pain mowing, especially around the entrance of your hive. So ideally set up your hive in a garden bed or something so you don't have to mow directly under the entrance, or you can put it on some kind of area that doesn't grow grass, whether it be weed matting or a concrete pad or some kind of wood chip garden, and that way it makes it a bit easier. But mowing in front of any beehive, they do get grumpy about it. They don't like the smell and the exhaust and the vibration and the noise, and depending on the genetics of your hive, they could get aggressive at that point. So when you mow, wear your bee suit, wear your gloves, protect yourself to minimise those things, and just go easy, just see how they're reacting, and if you're on a ride-on mower, you can whiz past, and then come back and have a look how they're going, and mow like that. If you're using a weed whacker, then that'll probably really annoy them. So you definitely want to be in your bee suit for that. Thank you so much for all your questions. We haven't got around to answering them all, so we'll do the rest online. And tune in again next week if there's something specific you'd like us to show and tell on a Wednesday. We're here to answer your questions. So tune in again next week, put your comments in the box below, and let us know what you'd like us to cover. Thank you very much for watching.